So guys, welcome to another presentation. Today we're going to do a quick overview of Workspace Essentials for 2024. We will start with the evaluation of the scene and the light conditions. We do a quick overview of the image sensor, the image signal path and the raw workflow. Then we will look at the enhanced raw format and the editing palette. And then I will do a few examples of a basic conversion, raw conversion in Workspace. I'm going to go quickly over the next 2 or 3 slides. I will discuss these in more detail in later presentations. I included them because everything starts from the scene. So when you look at the scene or the subject that you want to photograph, then it's good to start by evaluating the quality and direction of light. Study the scene, highlights and mid-range and shadows. Shadows are important because when you photograph a scene, the reflected light coming off the shadows is less than the mids or the highs. That means effectively you need a longer exposure time for the shadows to capture enough light. Now this is where the real advantage of a bigger sensor comes in. If you had the same pixels, so a 20 megapixel micro four thirds or 20 megapixel full frame, then the pixel area on the full frame will be significantly larger than the micro four thirds. The sensitivity of the full frame sensor will therefore increase, and therefore the ability to capture more light or more detail in the shadow. The answer for micro four thirds is a little bit more planning, shifting the histogram to the right and allowing the sensor to capture more light and more tonal information than on the auto exposure settings. So then the next step is to look at the white balance. You could have multiple situations. You could have shadow with a different white balance value versus mid-range or highlights. You need to take this in account. Then any reflected light surfaces. So you might have a car with bright surfaces. The best answer for that is not a high dynamic range sensor, but simply use a polarizer filter. And then how to manage your ISO brightness. I'm not going to go into detail now, but this is probably one of the most critical settings in your exposure calculation. And then we use ETTR for more tonal data, image quality and dynamic range. And then finally you will make a decision whether you will need a fill-in flash or possibly a LED panel, which can also help you to control the color temperature in the scene. The next point, which is really important to understand when you want to be successful in photographing and converting your raw files in Workspace, is to know that every sensor has a noise floor. Whether it's a medium format sensor, a full frame or a micro four thirds, every sensor has a noise floor. And on the right, you can see that if you follow my cursor here, that is the sensor's noise floor here, and above that you see the shot noise, and the combined noise is the noise floor of the camera or then the sensor. There are two important things to remember. Every sensor has unique technical characteristics. So the technical characteristics of your sensor is linked to the design of the sensor, and those are the noise floor, the native ISO setting, the saturation capacity of my sensor, and the dynamic range of my sensor. So here you can see the linear area, the operating area of the sensor on the right. There's my saturation capacity point, the maximum saturation I can get, and I can see the dynamic range here. So how will I get more dynamic range? If I ask the sensor designer to raise the saturation point, then I will get a higher dynamic range of the sensor. Or if Olympus asks the sensor manufacturer to lower the noise floor, then they can also increase the dynamic range because it has nothing to do with the size of the sensor. Then what is unique to the size of the sensor is the optical characteristics of your camera, and these are background blur, bokeh, depth of field, and subject isolation. And then one final point to control or manage my sensor is to look at the four exposure calculation variables that we as photographers influence. And these are the aperture, the shutter, the ISO, and the scene luminance. So on the first slide, we discussed scene luminance, looking at the scene, evaluating the scene, planning the scene. And this is the fourth variable, which is not included in the exposure triangle. And that's the reason I criticize the exposure triangle, because it does not give us enough information. Now we come to a more exciting part. Now that we looked at the scene, now that we understand the sensor, and that is the image signal path inside the camera. So it's happening in 3 steps. Step 1, step 2, and step 3, if you follow my cursor on the right. Step 1, you can see here on the left, it goes from the scene via the lens, shutter, aperture onto the sensor. Step 2 goes from the sensor, the image signal, to the true peak processor, the ISO amplifier, the art processor. And step 3, the art processor combined with a gamma curve to the final JPEG file. Having a quick look on the right here with the exposure controller. So the exposure controller is controlling 5 variables. The fifth one is the spot meter calculation, which we can't influence. It's a fixed setting. The 4, which we discussed, are the scene luminance, the shutter speed, f-stop, and ISO, which we influence. And here you can see that on the left, you can see that the shutter and aperture exposes the sensor. This is a very important concept. So if you go to the right again, from the scene, reflected light via the lens, via the shutter aperture onto the sensor. So I'm controlling the saturation level here on this graph here. I can control the saturation level of my sensor via the aperture shutter combination. Now this is important, so I can make sure that I don't clip my sensor with the aperture shutter. But what is critical when you start working like this is that you need to select your ISO beforehand. So then you fix your ISO, so you make a decision on the ISO for what shutter speed mainly you need. You set the ISO, you fix it, and then the histogram tells you what's happening on the sensor, because then the only 2 remaining variables are your aperture shutter. And then you can determine with your histogram whether you're clipping or not. So you also look at this graph here, the photons to electrons graph, to help you saturate your sensor. Once it's done, then you can move over to the true peak image processor. You can finalize your ISO setting. So for example, if you have any highlights clipping with a saturated sensor, bring down the ISO. If you're in a scene at night, then bring down the ISO to control the bulbs or the lights in the street, and you correct that in Workspace via the exposure compensation setting. So the exposure compensation setting and the ISO are basically the same thing, because my exposure controller information is shared via the enhanced raw format into Workspace. So I'm in Workspace, I'm basically still working inside the camera, if you may, and we will see that in the examples. The final step is to tweak the gamma curve, and I will explain that in the examples, and then the conversion to the JPEG file. So the final point here is enhanced raw format includes the camera settings, which helps us in the editing process. So How do I organize my editing settings in Workspace? Well, I basically follow the image signal path in the camera. So I rearranged my editing palette here. You can do that. So these are fixed editing menus on the top here. And this option here allows us to select and organize our editing settings or raw conversion functions in any format you like. Now, I prefer this format because it follows the image signal path, and you use the customize palette to do that. So, for example, if you look at the basic raw adjustments, which sort of corresponds to this first step here, then you see the first one is exposure compensation. Remember we were talking about the ISO and the exposure compensation in Workspace? This is here. This is right here. So now I can do any ISO corrections. If I drop my ISO, so remember you can drop your ISO with a saturated sensor. The SNR of the sensor, the visible noise, will not increase because when I drop my ISO, I still have a saturated sensor. And then I can do the correction in Workspace. I can set my white balance. I'll show you that in the example, the picture mode and the color space. And then we move over here to the gamma curve. And this is your tonal adjustment. So Olympus made it possible to tweak the gamma curve, the shadows, mids, and highs via tonal adjustments. The three settings here. These two are in the camera, and the tone curve is only in Workspace. Then you have, probably at this point here still, because we're still looking at the art processor and the gamma curve here. Then you have tonal color adjustments, where you can do targeted colors with a color adjust tool, or global colors like with the color creator in here. You'll find the color creator in the picture mode. And then you have typical image adjustments like saturation, contrast, sharpness, and then you do your noise filter. Now I use the standard noise filter of Olympus in my camera and in Workspace, probably 95 to 98% of the time. And I use the low option for the noise filter. With a correctly exposed sensor, I never have a noise problem in my camera. But if you are in a situation where you know you need a little more powerful noise filter, then select ISO 800, because the AI noise filter works from ISO 800 upwards for something like the EM123 and the OM1s. So now you have this. One final point. How to activate my camera settings in Workspace is simply by clicking each of these functions, because below the function is the camera settings. And I'll show you that in the example. So now we're going to look at 3 examples. I want to show you this one here. This is quite a unique image. If a quick look on the right, you can see it was a pen F with a 17mm f1.8. You can see my settings, 15th of a second, f8. I selected f8 because I wanted the movement in the scene here. I had an auto white balance setting here, natural for picture mode. I didn't use the highlight shadow control, and RGB. I always use RGB, and the ISO was set on 500. So if I click exposure compensation, then I'm selecting the function, and I can have a quick look at the bottom left here. If I have any clipping, there you can see I do have clipping. Let's take it down 3 points here. So I removed any clipping here. This setting here, I now adjusted the ISO. The ISO is part of the exposure calculation. So this clipping that you saw here was an image brightness clipping setting. It wasn't the sensor. It's really important to understand the difference. So when I did my exposure, I fixed the ISO, and I knew I didn't overexpose the sensor. The clipping that you then saw here was a result of the ISO, or the image brightness setting. Then if we go back to the right here, which is very interesting, is you can see which color temperature did the camera select. And if you look here, then you can see it was 5,938 Kelvin. And if you're happy with that, you can say, okay, I'm happy with that, and then you select that there. So now white balance is activated and the camera setting is activated. But I'm not completely happy with this here, so I'm going to select the gray point selection, and I'm moving my cursor right up here to the top left. So I want to measure these lights here, this condition here, and I'm going to click this white point there, and I'm more satisfied with this white balance selection. So I'm going to keep it there. The picture mode, you can again see here on the right, the camera was on natural like we saw on the XF data. I select that, but I want to go to the eye enhance, and I normally select the low version here. Now the eye enhance gives me a number of Olympus image quality benefits. So some Olympus technologies to improve my overall image quality. And that's why I like to use eye enhance. The color space we saw was RGB, so I select that. I didn't use highlight shadows in the camera. So what we can do here now is we can now start tweaking the gamma curve. That means I can up the shadows a little, and immediately you see the shadows are a little brighter. I can up the midtones just a little bit, and let's bring down the highlights. But now you can see that on the top here, I like to keep those areas dark, so I don't want them to be too bright here. So I'm going to bring back the shadows at one level. Let's see what it does. Let's bring down the midtones. Okay, I'm happy with that. I'm not going to use the gradation. You can see that I used natural in the camera. I'm just selecting that to have it available. And then we can look at the tone curve, which is still part of tweaking the gamma curve. You can see from the histogram here, I'm very safe on clipping and everything. So I'm going to add a small S curve in here. So my PC looks a little slow, but this is due to the latest upgrade or version of Workspace from OM Systems. Okay, so now I added a little contrast with the S-curve. It also gives me a sharpening effect, and it also gives me a sort of a saturation effect. And these are the reasons why I don't use saturation, contrast, and sharpness in Workspace or my camera, because I can do it with a tone curve. So with a final tone curve setting in Workspace. Now, in some of the older cameras, we don't have the highlight shadow function, and then I need to do everything in tone curves here. So what the final setting that we're going to do here is the noise filter, and I never use the false color suppression for the simple reason my sensor was saturated and the colors are normally okay. So I'm normally happy. And this is the final picture. I can now export this picture by selecting the top left here. I get to this window. I export the image as a 16-bit TIFF, and then I start editing the image in something like Photoshop. I just moved the camera data onto my PC via the enhanced RAW format, and I tweaked my camera settings. That's all I did here. This is quite a basic example, but it's still very valid. And what I want to show you here is right in the middle. If you look at the scene, you have deep shadows here. So I'm losing a little bit of the detail or the color information in this village here, including the trees. And I like to improve that. So again, I go back here, I have a quick look. I see I used the pen F in my 12-200. I was on 12mm here, f7.1, no exposure compensation. and the ISO was fixed on 200. So the histogram is showing me the sensor saturation level. This area here in the histogram is typical for auto exposure. It's just like a safety region, which we can explain in a different video. So again, I use my exposure compensation. Let's increase the exposure a little. And the reason I do that is to up the shadow information here. You can see from the histogram that I'm very safe still at this point. Let's go to half a stop. Okay. Again, you can see the camera's color temperature selection. I'm happy with that. I used I enhance low. I select that. I used RGB. I simply select that. And now I can start tweaking the gamma curve again. So I like the shadows to be a little brighter. So I do that. And now you can see that the shadow information here in the center of the image is really picking up. Now also here in the grass, in the darker areas, the information is becoming more visible. Not that critical for me. I was more interested in this area here. I can tone down the highlights just a little, just as a safety precaution. And I'm going to leave it like that. The gradation function was normal, and I can add again a little saturation. Now I normally like to move my histogram. Now the moment I do that, I start clipping, so I'm going to ignore that. I'm just going to push it back. There's nothing wrong to push it back. So here I'm now adding my S-curve, little up there. Just a very slight S-curve is enough. And this is sort of the final image. So all I still need to do here is to go and look at the noise filter. Again, I'm battling here with a slower software. I've done the noise correction or the noise filter, and I can now export this as a TIFF file, and I can really start editing the data here, especially in this village area. Now remember what we did here. We now exporting a optimized tonal quality image to Photoshop. I'm now receiving the best possible data from Olympus in Photoshop to edit. The next one is quite an interesting example. Again, if you look at the XF data on the top, it was the pen F, the 17mm f1.8. These are my camera settings. Now I used a exposure compensation of plus or a third EV, which is, you can see why, especially for the shadows here. I had my ISO fixed on 400, and I used the highlight shadow function. Let's have a look and see what it's like, what I did here. So here's my exposure compensation. I'm going to bring this down to minus 0.9, which takes away the clipping here. So now I remove the clipping. Well, let's have a look at the color temperature. I'm going to use the camera's color temperature. I'm happy with that. I'm going to use I enhance like normal, the low version. And then I'm going to do something interesting. Before I go to the highlight shadow on the tone curves, I'm going to select auto here. So for the gradation, I'm going to use auto, which helps me to brighten the shadow areas. And it also controls the highlights so that I don't reclip again. So, and you can also see this is a fairly flat profile on the gamma curve at now. So I've been really tweaking the gamma curve quite extensively with this setting here. Now let's take this back. So I don't want any shadows and highlights adjustments here. So what I've done now is I've reset the shadows and highlights settings of the camera. So I took them back to zeros. So we only see the gradation auto effect here now. And now we can basically go back and we can add contrast in the tone curve. Yeah, I'm going to bring down the shadows a little bit more aggressive, and the midtones. to correct for the gradation function. My histogram is nicely at the to the right here, and then I can do my noise filter. So now I have a basic image which is edited with a focus on higher tonal data, especially for the shadow areas. And I can now export this again in 16-bit TIFF and really edit it in Photoshop. So I want to show you a last example or a final example. This is, I selected this for the interesting sake of having an older Olympus camera. So whether I use the latest Olympus cameras or a really old Olympus camera, you can see here I use the XZ1, which is a 10 megapixel CCD sensor. What is interesting about the CCD sensor, it is similar to a BSI sensor. I get the same type of efficiency or sensitivity from a CCD than one would get from a BSI sensor. The pixel area is also larger than on the XZ2, for example. The XZ2 is a BSI sensor, but I effectively get a benefit from the XZ1, which also explains the fantastic image quality we get of the XZ1. And then interesting here is look at this nice background blur and the isolation here from the small sensors. Don't you find this interesting? So again, I select the exposure compensation, my ISO setting, if you may. I bring it down. Let's take it a third step down. And doing that, I'm canceling any clipping here on the top. I select again, so even for this old camera, I can select the white balance that the camera used here. So I'm happy with this white balance. Now, this camera didn't have eye enhance. It was before the days of eye enhance. So I'm going to select vivid here, or the camera I used vivid in the camera also. I used sRGB for the camera. I need to go back and change my camera settings, but let's select RGB, and you can immediately see the color richness improved. Now this camera doesn't have a highlight shadow function. It was before the days of highlight shadows, and therefore you can do no adjustments here. So let's close this. You could use gradation, but you don't have you do have the auto option. So you could even use the auto option if you need to. And then the final setting to tweak my gamma curve would then be the tonal curve here, but I don't need to. Let's do a small tweak here. And I basically do the tweak only for sharpness and contrast. So a small tweak, which gives me a little bit more sharpness feeling. And then finally, we can again do the noise filter. I want to use the low noise filter. And then you can crop the image, for example. So if you go here, you press crop, you do the manual option and select the 16:9, for example. I like this. And then if you click there again, you cropped your image. So now I can transfer this image or export this image in 16-bit TIFF, and I can do any final editing in Photoshop. But I'm happy with this image as is. So let's go back to the presentation. So I want to close with a few final thoughts. And this is an overview of what we did in this presentation. The highlighted comments here on the left, these are concepts or things that you need to focus on if you want to improve your photography, your digital photography together with Workspace. So pixel area influences sensitivity, like better shadow noise. Pixel count affects the noise floor. More pixels add more noise. So would a Sony A1 be that much better in the shadows than a EM13 or OM1? Not really, because the pixel area on the A1 is not much bigger than the Olympus, which means it doesn't have the pixel area benefit of a 24 or a 20 megapixel full frame sensor. And this is why it's important to look at sensor area. The next one is shutter speed, and aperture controls my sensor saturation, S and R levels. And then the ISO plus Workspace manage highlights. So I can do it in the camera with the ISO or in Workspace. That is, if I have a saturated sensor, which is not clipping, and you now know how to adjust your camera not to clip the sensor. And then the enhanced raw format is unique to Workspace. If you open a Olympus RAW file in Lightroom or in Photoshop or in Photolab, then you don't have the camera settings available like you have them available here in Workspace. And the TruePix image processor is basically available in Workspace. And then I convert my RAW files to 16-bit TIFFs, which gives me a tonal-rich file to edit in Photoshop. So guys, a final thought. Those who learn that sensor size is only one of many variables are free to grow their digital photography skills. Thank you.